August 17th. Hyliion's worth about $725 million, as you see here in the market cap. It expects only around $15 million in revenue this year, so a ton of capex is still being spent inside the company, and its Carno power technology is just beginning to commercialize. So why am I looking at it as a potential 10x stock? Because AI data centers need enormous amounts of electricity, and Hyliion is developing a modular power system designed to generate that electricity directly on site. So at roughly $4.06, a 10x would put Hyliion around $40 and Hyliion's valuation at around $7.25 billion. And that's a huge leap. So today we're going to figure out what actually has to happen for Hyliion to get there, and can its Carno power module scale? Will customers buy it? Can Hyliion turn potential opportunities into real orders and revenue? And could this technology actually become part of the solution to AI's massive power problem? So welcome to Monday Stock Hunt, and let's start with the problem. The AI boom started with a race for compute. Who has the GPUs or the chips, and who can build the biggest data center? But there's a problem. Eventually, you got to turn all those GPUs on, and the amount of electricity these AI campuses need is becoming ginormous. We're increasingly talking about data center campuses requiring hundreds of megawatts, in some cases even gigawatts. Some of the biggest proposed AI projects are moving towards gigawatt scale power requirements. You can't just plug that into a wall. You need generation. You need transmission, substations, transformers, grid connections, permits, and all that takes something AI companies don't want to waste, which is time. And that's why one phrase is becoming increasingly important: time to power. How quickly can you get electricity to the site? Because you can have billions of dollars of GPU sitting inside a brand new data center, but if you cannot get enough electricity to the building, then none of it matters. And in some markets, getting the necessary grid infrastructure can take years, and that's changing the conversation. Instead of asking, when can the grid bring us enough power, data center developers are increasingly considering another option. Can we generate the power ourselves? Behind the meter generation, on-site power, bring your own power, and that's why we're seeing increasing attention around gas turbines, fuel cells, engines, and other distributed generation technologies, and potentially Carno from Hyliion is not an AI chip company. It does not make GPUs. It does not build data centers, and is trying to solve the problem that comes after all that. How do you power them? And that's what makes this little $4 stock interesting, because to understand whether Hyliion actually belongs in the AI power conversation, we got to understand what it's building. So what exactly is a Carno? Carno is Hyliion's modular power generation technology. I'm not going to turn this into an engineering class, but for the investment thesis, there are really four things we need to understand. And the first is fuel flexibility. Carno is designed to operate using multiple fuels that could allow customers to use the fuel infrastructure available today while maintaining flexibility in their energy strategy change if their energy strategy changes in the future. And the second is efficiency. Hyliion has targeted high electrical efficiency, and that's important because applications like data centers could require these systems to generate electricity around the clock. And fuel efficiency matters. Third, we have low maintenance. Carno uses a different mechanical architecture than a traditional generator, and Hyliion is designing the system around lower maintenance requirements. For data center, reliability is not optional. If you're generating your own electricity because you can't depend entirely on the grid, that power plant has to work. That power plant for the data center has to work. But the fourth characteristic may be the most important for the Hyliion thesis. Carno is modular. Hyliion doesn't necessarily need to build one enormous generator, as the idea is to manufacture standardized Carno power modules and combine them to create larger power plants. Think of it almost like building blocks for electricity. Need more power, add more modules. And Hyliion's Carno management system is designed to coordinate those individual generators so they can operate together as one larger system. That means the same basic technology can potentially serve very different customers, commercial facilities, military installations, industrial sites, and eventually AI data centers. But here's the catch: Carno is not a mass market commercial product yet. Hyliion's approaching the transition from development and validation into commercialization, and that's where this investment starts getting much more interesting. So Hyliion is transitioning from development and validation into early commercial deployment. Initial deployments and early deliveries are expected to begin in late 2026 for the Carnos, and that's important when we look at Hyliion's current revenue. The company generated approximately $4.94 million in quarter two in 2026, significantly above the roughly $2.4 million consensus estimate. Management then increased full year 2026 revenue guidance by about 50% to approximately $15 million. That's good progress. But don't look at that $15 million and assume Carno commercial sales are already taken off. A significant portion of Hyliion's current revenue is coming from development and validation work, including government programs. The real commercial ramp is still ahead, and that's what makes this investment so interesting. Hyliion's approaching one of the most difficult transitions from any technology company, building the technology and then selling the technology, because plenty of technologies work in development, plenty of prototypes look impressive, but commercialization is where the business gets tested. Can Hyliion manufacture Carno reliably? Can it deliver systems on time? Can those systems operate continuously in real world environments? And can customers achieve the economics Hyliion's promising? And most importantly, will customers actually pay for the Carnos? And that's why $15 million revenue number is the most important number in this thesis. What matters is what happens after that. If Carnos succeed, today's revenue could eventually look tiny. And if commercialization fails, today's $725 million valuation could look extremely expensive. So we're investing in the possibility that Hyliion is approaching an inflection point. You've got development, validation, the early deployment in late 2026, and then the commercialization scale is the next test. But before customers trust Carno with increasingly large power requirements, Hyliion has to prove that the modular concept actually works. And just recently, it took an important step. So on August 3rd, Hyliion announced one of the most important developments in the Carno story, as it successfully demonstrated multiple Carno Power Modules operating together as one coordinated generation system. The demonstration used two 200 kilowatt Carno units and put them together to make 400 kilowatts. But simply connecting two generators isn't the interesting part. The important part was that what happened when electrical demand changed. The two Carno units automatically shared the changing load while maintaining stable power. Hyliion's Carno management system coordinated them. Together, they behave like one larger power plant. That's important because it validates one of the central ideas behind Hyliion's commercialization strategy, which is modular power or modularity. The company is developing an approximately 800 kilowatt standardized building block. From there, multiple 200 kilowatt units could theoretically be configured into larger systems, as 4 modules equals 800 kilowatts, 12 2.4 megawatts, 16 modules equals 3.2 megawatts, and potentially larger installations beyond that. Now, we need to be careful, as Hyliion has not demonstrated a massive AI data center running on dozens of hundreds of Carno units. What Hyliion demonstrated was two 200 kilowatt units operating together. That's 400 kilowatts. It does not prove that Hyliion can operate a huge multi-mega unit commercial power plant continuously for years. But it does answer an important first question. Can multiple Carno units communicate? share changing loads and operate together. Hyliion has demonstrated that they can. And there's another interesting feature as well, as one Carno module can coordinate the system, but if that module becomes unavailable, another module can assume that responsibility, and that potentially reduces the single point of failure. For applications like data centers, those three words matter. These three words matter: reliability, redundancy, and scalability. The significance of the August 3rd demonstration was not that 400 kilowatts is an enormous amount of electricity, as it is not. The significance was demonstrating the architecture Hyliion intends to use to get bigger. And then only 3 days later, one of the most demanding customers imaginable put serious money behind taking Carno to the next level, and that is the United States Navy. On August 6th of 2026, Hyliion announced the largest military contract in the company's history. The Office of Naval Research awarded Hyliion $41.7 million. The Navy wants Hyliion to design, develop, and deliver 2 multi-megawatt KARNO Power Modules for validation in land and maritime applications.
Thomas Healy, Hyliion founder and CEO, joins me now with more. Thomas, always good to see you. Thanks for joining the program. We understand that this contract represents your biggest military contract to date. How significant is this?
This was a huge milestone for us. So last time we spoke, I think we chatted a little bit about we're actually already working with the military on powering the very neat unmanned autonomous Navy vessels that the military is building. So that's a great use case for our technology. But the military is liking what they're seeing with our power modules. And so now they've said, hey, why don't we actually move to powering bases as well as going into larger ships? So this is really an expansion of the work we're doing with the Navy. And then just yesterday on our earnings call, we also announced we're expecting another contract from a different branch of the military. So overall, the military is really liking the product. We see it as a great way to solve their power problem. And it's great to see contracts starting to come in to work towards that.
So you have one system, 2+ megawatts, the other 3+ megawatts. And this takes us directly back to what we discussed. Hyliion has demonstrated 2 200 kilowatt modules working together. And now the U.S. Navy is helping fund the next step, multi-megawatt Carno. And this is the Navy's first involvement. With this latest contract, cumulative Office of Naval Research funding for Carno has surpassed $58 million, as you see here. The relationship has progressed through initial validation, testing, upcoming at-sea trials, multi-megawatt development, and that's what I want to see. Progression. Is the customer continue to invest? Is the project getting larger? Are technical requirements becoming more demanding? And in this case, they are. Why is the Navy interested? Fuel flexibility, efficiency, low maintenance, resilience, and Hyliion also points to Carno's relatively low acoustic and thermal signatures. But there's another reason this contract matters to investors, as the Navy is helping Hyliion fund the development of the same general capability it needs for larger commercial markets, which is multi-megawatt power. It does not mean the Navy has proven Carno will work economically in an AI data center. It has not. And this is not a contract to deploy Carno across the Navy fleet. The Navy's paying Hyliion to develop and deliver systems for validation. That's an important distinction. But I look at this contract as something more than revenue. I look at it as funded validation. Hyliion gets paid while developing and scaling Carno. And if that development succeeds, the lesson learned does not necessarily stop at the fence, because another market desperately needs multi-megawatt power, and that is AI data centers. Now, put everything that we've learned together. AI needs enormous amounts of power, and the grid can't always provide it quickly enough. Carno is modular. Hyliion has demonstrated multiple units operating together, and now the Navy's funding the jump into multi-megawatt systems. That's why data center opportunity matters, or the data center opportunity matters. Instead of waiting years for enough grid capacity, the idea is to potentially put generation directly beside the data center for the data centers to bring their own power. And there's an important reality check. A 3.2 megawatt Carno configuration would be a meaningful power plant. A hyperscale AI campus requires hundreds of megawatts, is on an entirely different level. We're not talking about 16 Carno modules suddenly powering an entire gigawatt AI campus. Hyliion would have to scale far beyond what has been demonstrated today. That creates one of the biggest questions in this thesis. Can Carno go from hundreds of kilowatts to a few megawatts and then to tens of megawatts and potentially beyond that? Can they even get to a gigawatt? We don't know yet, but Hyliion doesn't necessarily have to power an entire hyperscale campus on one day, as there could be opportunities in individual buildings, smaller data centers, incremental capacity, primary on-site generation, supplemental generation, industrial facilities, and potential larger installations as the technology matures. The next couple of years are going to tell us a lot. Carno needs to leave the development environment. It needs to get installed at a real customer sites. It needs to get installed at real customer sites, and it needs to accumulate operating hours. Customers need to see the reliability and economics. And then they have to power the most important question: do we want more? That's when this stops being a technology story and starts to become a commercial story. And Hyliion says customers are already expressing significant interest. The potential opportunity associated with the company's non-binding letters of intent exceeds $400 million. For a company expected around $15 million of revenue this year, that's an enormous number. But there's a huge difference between potential interest and actual revenue. And that's where we need to become skeptical. Hyliion has announced more than $400 million in potential commercial opportunities associated with non-binding letters of intent, which sounds incredible, but a letter of intent is not a purchase order. It's definitely not revenue, and an LOI can tell us that a potential customer is interested enough to discuss deploying Carno. And that's useful, but the investment thesis does not work because customers sign letters saying they might buy the technology. It works if those letters become an LOI, a firm purchase order, a delivery, a revenue, and then a repeat order. And that's the conversion that we're looking for. One of the most discussed agreements involves the potential deployment of as many as 250 Carno cores. And that agreement has attracted controversy. A short seller report questioned the commercial substance of the agreement. Following that report, shareholder rights law firms announced an investigation of potential securities claims, and an investigation is not proof Hyliion did anything wrong. And allegations from a short seller aren't automatically facts, but investors should not ignore the controversy either. Instead, I think it reinforces exactly how we should evaluate the company. Don't value Hyliion as though every LOI is guaranteed revenue. Make Hyliion prove it, and the milestones are easy to understand. Show me the purchase orders. Show me systems leaving the factory. Show me customer installations. Show me operating history, and show me revenue, and eventually show me repeat orders. And that's how $400 million number becomes meaningful, because even a meaningful portion of that potential opportunity converting into firm business could dramatically change Hyliion's revenue profile. And we're starting around $15 million. Imagine eventually reaching 100 or 200 million, and eventually potentially hundreds of millions in annual commercial sales. And that's when this becomes a completely different business. So I don't want to use the 400 million number as the reason to buy Hyliion. I want to use it as a scoreboard. Over the next several quarters, how much of that converts to actual revenue? If very little converts, and that's a warning sign. If Hyliion starts announcing meaningful firm orders, deployments, and repeat business, the thesis gets stronger. Because the hardest question isn't whether people are interested in Carno, it's whether they're interested enough to buy it. And if they do, Hyliion needs enough money to deliver. Now let's look at the Hyliion financial side of the company. Hyliion closed August 14th at approximately $4.06, and today it's around $4.10 as of Monday, August 17th. As I stated previously, market capitalization is around $725 million. The revenue guidance is around $15 million approximately, and that tells us something immediately. If you valued Hyliion like an established power company based on today's revenue, the stock would look extremely expensive. Investors aren't really paying for today's business. They're paying for what Carno could become. And there was encouraging progress in quarter two as revenue came in at approximately $5 million, $4.9 million, versus consensus expectations of around $2.4 million, as you see here. Management subsequently increased full year guidance by approximately 50% to around $15 million. But again, this isn't a mass producing Carno revenue story. Current revenue remains heavily connected to development and validation activities. Management expects Q3 revenue just under $5 million, roughly flat sequentially as some existing R&D contracts wind down while newer awards begin to ramp up. So the bigger financial question is, does Hyliion have enough money to reach commercial scale? And the picture has improved. Hyliion expects 2026 net cash burn of approximately $30 to $35 million. Management expects to finish the year with $30 to $35 million cash burn, ending the year $115 to $120 million in cash and investments. That's a meaningful cushion, but commercializing hardware is expensive, and Hyliion has to expand manufacturing, build inventory, install systems, support customers before commercial revenue reaches scale. If commercialization takes longer than expected, cash keeps disappearing. And eventually, Hyliion could need additional capital, and that could mean dilution. So here's one of the simple financial scoreboards for this investment. Commercial revenue up. So could Hyliion 10x, or what would it take to 10x? At around $4.06 a share, Hyliion's approximately worth $725 million. And a 10x would put the stock around $40, going from $725 million company to a $7.25 billion company is not that easy. Hyliion would have to become a completely different business. Remember, we're starting with approximately $15 million of 2026 revenue guidance. So the 10x thesis is not that Hyliion deserves a $7 billion valuation today. It does not. The thesis is that Carno could eventually create a business large enough to support that kind of valuation. So let's work backwards. What would actually have to happen? First, Carno has to work in the real world with not just demonstrations, not just testing. Carno needs to accumulate thousands of operating hours at actual customer sites. Reliability has to be proven and efficiency has to be proven. The economics have to make sense. Second, the first commercial deployments have to succeed. Late 2026 is important. That's when Hyliion expects to begin initial deployments and early deliveries. And that's when this starts moving from deployments to commercialization. Third, you got the LOIs that have to convert. Hyliion has more than $400 million of potential commercial opportunities. And if anybody doesn't know, LOIs are letters of intent. I don't need all $400 million to convert, but I do need to start seeing firm purchase orders. That's one of the easiest things for us to track. And fourth is Hyliion has to prove multi-watt mega scale. The 400 kilowatt demonstration was an important first step, as the Navy's now funding future development of 2+ and 3+ megawatt systems. But if Carno is going to become meaningful in data centers, Hyliion eventually needs to prove the architecture can scale beyond that. Fifth is data center adoption, and the data center customers have to show up. This could be the biggest accelerator of the entire thesis, as Hyliion doesn't need to power every AI data center, doesn't need to replace the grid. It doesn't need to beat every turbine, engine, or fuel cell company. It needs to capture a meaningful piece of rapidly growing distributed power market. And if Carno can solve a real problem around time and power, there could be a market for it. And then comes the manufacturing ramp. Building development units is one thing. Producing them repeatedly, reliably, and economically is completely different. And Hyliion has to prove it can manufacture Carno at commercial scale. And eventually, all of this has to show up in one place, which is revenue. This is where I want to put the 10x opportunity into perspective. Today, we're talking about roughly $15 million of annual revenue. At a hypothetical 10 times sales valuation, that would support roughly $5 billion. Now imagine $750 million of annual revenue at 10 times sales. That's $7.5 billion or $1 billion of annual revenue. At a lower 7 times sales valuation would also equal roughly $7 billion. And those are not my revenue forecasts, and those are not price targets. I'm using them to show the scale of business Hyliion would eventually have to build for a $7 billion plus valuation to make sense. And then there's also another huge variable, which are margins. If Hyliion eventually becomes a high growth power company with attractive margins, the market could assign it a premium valuation. And if Carno becomes a lower margin hardware business, investors may assign it at a much lower multiple. So don't get hung up on whether the right number is 500 million, 750 million, or $1 billion. The important point is $15 million is not enough. Hyliion eventually needs to build a business generating hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial revenue for the 10x thesis to become credible. That's why the roadmap is so important. Carno works, commercial deployments succeed, LOIs become firm orders, megawatt systems are validated, data center customers arrive, manufacturing scales, and then revenue reaches hundreds of millions of dollars. That's the road from 725 million to potentially $7 billion. There's a lot of steps between those two numbers. Every one of them creates an opportunity for something to go wrong, which brings us to the other side of the 10x thesis. So the upside here is enormous, but so is the execution risk. And rather than spending 10 minutes going through every possible thing that could go wrong, I think there are 4 major thesis killers that we need to watch. And the first is if Carno does not scale. 200 kilowatt units working together is encouraging, but that's a long way from a large commercial power plant operating continuously. The Navy's multi-megawatt program should give us much more information. But until those larger systems are built, tested, and validated, scaling remains a risk. The second thesis killer is customers don't convert. This might be even more important, as Hyliion can announce $400 million, $500 million, or $1 billion of potential opportunities, and none of those numbers matter if customers don't actually buy Carno. That's why I'm going to keep coming back to the purchase orders and the deployments and the revenue. The third major risk is manufacturing. If Hyliion can't manufacture the Carnos at scale, great technology doesn't automatically create a great manufacturing business. And once volume increases, Hyliion has to manage supply chains, quality, cost, production speed, installation, service, and reliability. And there might be a dilution of shares in the future as well. And that's a completely different change from building development units. The fourth thesis killer is Hyliion runs out of time or money. Hyliion expects to finish 2026 with approximately 115 million to 120 in cash investments, and that's a meaningful cushion. But if commercialization keeps getting pushed back late 2026 to 2027 or 2028, then cash continues to disappear, Hyliion could need additional capital, which could mean dilution, as said before. And there are other risks as well. Hyliion's competing against established power generation companies with enormous manufacturing capacity, service networks, and customer relationships, such as GE Vernova or Caterpillar. Gas turbines, reciprocating engines, fuel cells, potential nuclear such as Bloom Energy or NNE. Carno doesn't just have to work, it has to give customers a reason to choose it. And we also have the controversy surrounding one of Hyliion's non-binding LOIs. As a short seller and subsequent securities law investigations are something investors should monitor. But I don't think we need to speculate about who ultimately turns out to be right. There's a much easier way to settle the argument, and that is execution. Don't give me another LOI, give me purchase orders, give me deployments, revenue, and eventually repeat customers, because from this point forward, execution determines what happens next. So after everything we've looked at and researched, where does Hyliion rank on the Monday Stock Hunt 10X score? For market opportunity gets a 9.5 out of 10. AI power requirements are exploding and distributed generation is becoming increasingly important. The potential market is easily large enough to support a company many times Hyliion's current size. For technology and mode, it gets an 8.5 out of 10. Carno is differentiated in the modular architecture, fuel flexibility, and potential efficiency and maintenance advantages are compelling. But I can't score the mode higher until we see how Carno performs against competing technologies at commercial scale. For commercial traction, it's a 7 out of 10. The $41.7 million Navy contract matters. More than $58 million of cumulative ONR funding matters, and the commercial LOIs demonstrate potential customer interest. But this score can't go higher until we start seeing firm commercial orders and deployments. Now, for the financial position of the company, it's an 8 out of 10. Hyliion has a meaningful cash position relative to its expected burn, but manufacturing could become expensive and delays could eventually increase dilution risk. Finally, 10x risk reward is an 8 out of 10. The upside is enormous if Carno successfully moves from deployment and development into a real commercial power platform. This remains a high execution risk investment. Put everything together, and Hyliion receives our 8.2 out of 10 score. 8.2 out of 10. My verdict is potential 10x candidate. Not because I think 40 is guaranteed, but because $400 million of potential opportunities are guaranteed. And not because putting the words AI and power together automatically creates a great investment. Hyliion gets an 8.2 because it has what we're looking for a Monday stock hunt. A relatively small company, a differentiated technology, a massive potential market, serious external validation, and approaching commercial catalyst, and enough uncertainty that opportunity isn't already completely proven. So now we watch the milestones: multi-megawatt validation, commercial deployments, firm orders, data center customers, and ultimately revenue. And that's the Hyliion thesis. And that's what Monday Stock Hunt's all about. Every Monday, we're looking for another company that could potentially become much larger than it is today. So if you enjoyed the hunt, like and subscribe to 20-Minute Stock Hunt. If you want to go deeper into research behind these videos, check out the Stock Hunter Insider at the AI Factory on buymeacoffee.com. And that's where we'll be posting extended research notes behind Monday's Stock Hunt, the AI Factory series on Wednesdays, and keeping company deep dives, thesis updates, and other stocks we're researching, as well as portfolio updates. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.